The Gilded Age was the era of legendary steel magnates and powerful railroad barons, of sprawling, glittering mansions lining Fifth Avenue, and of outrageously lavish parties that stretched from dusk until dawn. It was a period when the nation was flexing its newfound industrial might, deeply convinced of its own manifest destiny. Yet this brilliant veneer of progress and propriety was, in reality, a thin layer of gold paint covering the much harsher, often brutal, realities of life for most people. At the very center of this world of meticulously crafted appearances stood the White House, a building whose image was paramount. It was, in essence, the nation's ultimate calling card, the grand symbol of American power and grace to the rest of the world. The social heart of this universe was, without question, the First Lady. She was expected to be the flawless embodiment of Victorian virtue, a captivating and gracious hostess, a completely devoted wife, and the unwavering cultural and moral standard bearer for the entire country. In today's video, we'll explore the story of Mary Scott Harrison McKee, a woman who had successfully built her own independent life, only to be unexpectedly summoned back to the absolute epicenter of American power to confront an impossible decision. She was asked to become the smiling public face of a presidency at the exact moment her own family was being quietly consumed by a slow-moving tragedy. She would flawlessly perform every single duty, master every intricate protocol, and shoulder the full weight and every burden of the First Lady's office. To understand Mary Harrison McKee, you must first understand the weight of the name she carried. The Harrisons were American political royalty, though of a rugged Midwestern sort. Her great-grandfather, Benjamin Harrison V, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Her grandfather was William Henry Harrison, the famed general of Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, a man who rode into the presidency in 1841 on a wave of populist enthusiasm, delivered the longest inaugural address in history in the freezing March air, and died of pneumonia just 31 days later, securing a legacy of tragic brevity. The presidency, therefore, was both a family triumph and a cautionary tale. It was into this lineage that Mary's father, Benjamin Harrison, was born. He was a man who seemed to embody the contradictions of his era. In the courtroom and on the political stage, he was a formidable presence, a brilliant lawyer and a gifted orator whose logic was said to be as sharp and cold as ice. He served with distinction as a general in the Civil War, leading his men with courage. Yet in person, he was famously reserved, aloof, and so formal that he was often given the unkind nickname, the human iceberg. The warmth in the Harrison household came from Mary's mother, Caroline Scott Harrison. She was a woman of formidable intellect and quiet grace, a graduate of the Oxford Female Institute in Ohio, where her father was a science professor. It was there she met the young Benjamin Harrison. Theirs was a partnership built on mutual respect and deep affection. Caroline was a talented artist, a devout Presbyterian, and a woman with a keen sense of social duty. She was the anchor of the family, the one who softened her husband's sharp edges and created a home filled with culture and stability. Mary Scott Harrison was born in Indianapolis in 1858, their second child and only daughter to survive to adulthood. She grew up in a world where duty, honor, and public service were the air she breathed. Her childhood was one of privilege and propriety, dictated by the strict social codes of Victorian America. A young woman of her standing was expected to master the arts of conversation, music, and household management. Her education was designed not to foster a career, but to prepare her for the most important role a woman could aspire to, that of a wife to a man of equal or greater stature. And Mary fulfilled this expectation perfectly. In 1884, she married James Robert McKee, a promising young businessman with a keen eye for the burgeoning industrial landscape. Theirs was a solid, respectable match, and they soon began a family of their own, welcoming a son, Benjamin, and a daughter, Mary. For a time, it seemed Mary's life was set on a comfortable and predictable course. She was Mrs. James McKee, a wife and mother in Indianapolis, her life defined by her own home, her own family, and her own social circle. Her father's world of politics was a familiar backdrop, but it was his stage, not hers. That all changed in 1888. After a term in the U.S. Senate, her father secured the Republican nomination for president. He ran a novel front porch campaign, receiving official delegations and delivering dozens of speeches from the veranda of his Indianapolis home. It was a family affair. Caroline and Mary were expected to act as hostesses, welcoming these throngs of supporters with tea and polite conversation, a small-scale rehearsal for the duties that awaited them. When Harrison defeated the incumbent Grover Cleveland that November, the family's private life was officially over. The McKees would be packing their bags and moving with the new president and first lady into the most famous and most scrutinized house in America. The White House that greeted the Harrisons in 1889 was not the pristine museum it is today. It was a rambling, aging structure, technologically behind the times and plagued by a persistent rat problem. But it was now their home and the center of their universe. The family that moved in was a crowd: the president and first lady, their daughter Mary and her husband James, and their two small children. This multi-generational living arrangement was unusual, and it immediately drew the nation's attention. While the president grappled with tariffs and foreign policy, the American public found a much more captivating story: his grandson. Mary's son, Benjamin Harrison McKee, quickly became a national obsession. The press dubbed him Baby McKee, and he was, in essence, America's first celebrity child. In an era of stiff, formal photography, pictures of the rosy-cheeked toddler playing on the White House lawn were a sensation. He had a pony named His Nibs and a pet goat named Old Whiskers, who was famous for pulling him around in a small cart. The stories were endless and endearing. Baby McKee would wander into cabinet meetings, forcing the stern president to melt and break into a smile. He was a symbol of joy and innocence that provided a perfect, humanizing counterpoint to his grandfather's stoic public image. For Mary, her son's fame was likely a mixed blessing, a source of pride, but also a constant reminder that her family was living in a fishbowl, their private moments transformed into public consumption. Meanwhile, her mother Caroline embraced the role of First Lady with a surprising and modernizing vigor. She found the White House's historical records in disarray and began a systematic effort to catalog its contents, laying the groundwork for the historical preservation that later First Ladies like Jacqueline Kennedy would champion. She famously designed and painted her own official state china service, featuring the goldenrod and corn, symbols of the American heartland. She was also a quiet trailblazer. She arranged for the first Christmas tree to be put up inside the White House, a tradition we now take for granted. And, after a lengthy battle for funding, she oversaw the installation of electricity in the mansion. The new technology, however, was terrifying to the presidential couple. Both Benjamin and Caroline were so afraid of getting a shock that they would often refuse to touch the switches, sometimes leaving the lights burning all night until a staff member could safely turn them off in the morning. During these first couple of years, Mary's role was primarily that of a supportive daughter and mother. She assisted Caroline with her social duties, helping to host the endless receptions and teas. She managed her own children in this extraordinary environment, trying to carve out a space for a normal family life amidst the pomp and circumstance. It was a delicate balancing act, but one she seemed to manage with quiet competence. The Harrison White House, with 3 generations under one roof, projected an image of wholesome, all-American family life. But a cruel and invisible enemy had already breached its walls: tuberculosis. In the 19th century, they called it consumption because of the way it seemed to consume a person from the inside out, leaving them frail, pale, and breathless. It was the leading cause of death, a terrifying and relentless disease with no known cure. In late 1891, the White House physicians delivered the devastating diagnosis to First Lady Caroline Harrison. At first, the family kept the news private. The First Lady curtailed her public schedule, citing fatigue. But the disease was relentless. The vibrant, active woman who had founded the Daughters of the American Revolution and lobbied Congress for White House renovations began to fade. Her persistent cough echoed in the private quarters, and her increasing weakness became impossible to hide. This is the moment Mary McKee's life pivoted irrevocably. The social calendar of the White House is a merciless machine. It does not stop for illness or grief. Dinners for foreign dignitaries, receptions for Congress, the weekly public levees. These were not mere parties. They were essential functions of the state. As Caroline's strength waned, the responsibility for orchestrating this complex social world began to shift, silently and unofficially, to her daughter. It started small. Mary would stand beside her mother in receiving lines, taking over when Caroline grew too tired. Then she began to host smaller events on her own. Before long, she was the one meeting with the chief usher, planning menus, approving flower arrangements, and greeting official guests at the door. She became the de facto White House hostess, a role she neither sought nor formally held. Imagine the immense psychological strain. Every day she would tend to her ailing mother, witnessing the slow, painful progression of the disease. She would see the toll it was taking on her father, who was trying to run a country, while his wife was dying in the room down the hall. And then she would have to descend the grand staircase, put on a gracious smile, and make polite conversation with hundreds of people, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. She was living a dual existence: upstairs a private life of fear and anticipatory grief, downstairs a public life of choreographed grace. A rarely discussed detail of this period is the sheer physical discomfort of the White House itself. Caroline had long complained that the building was unhealthy, with poor ventilation and sanitation. There's a tragic irony in the fact that she had fought so hard for renovations to make the executive mansion a healthier place to live, only to fall victim to a respiratory disease within its very walls. By the summer of 1892, the situation was dire. The family moved the First Lady to the Adirondacks, hoping the mountain air might work a miracle. But there would be no miracle. They returned to Washington in September, to a city thick with the heat of a presidential election. President Harrison, running for a second term, largely ceased campaigning. His focus was entirely on his wife. The political world held its breath as the deeply personal drama of the first family overshadowed the national election. On the morning of October 25, 1892, just 2 weeks before Election Day, First Lady Caroline Harrison died in her bedroom at the White House. She was 60 years old. The nation plunged into mourning. The White House was draped in black crepe. For the president, it was a cataclysmic blow. For his daughter, Mary, the moment she had been dreading had arrived. Her unofficial stopgap role was now her undisputed reality. In the midst of her own profound grief, she was now, in every practical sense, the First Lady of the United States. The 5 months between her mother's death in October 1892 and her father's departure from office in March 1893 were a surreal and somber period for Mary McKee. Her father, shattered by his loss and his subsequent electoral defeat to Grover Cleveland, largely withdrew from the social obligations of the presidency. The responsibility for maintaining the dignity and function of the White House fell squarely on Mary's shoulders. She oversaw the traditional large-scale New Year's Day reception in 1893, a major event where the president and the lady of the house would greet thousands of citizens. It must have been an incredibly draining experience, shaking hand after hand, offering polite greetings, all while the family was still in the deepest period of mourning. She managed the final state dinners and receptions of the Harrison administration with a quiet competence that was widely praised in the Washington press. She was, by every possible measure, performing the job of the First Lady. And yet, the title was never conferred upon her. In the 21st century, this might seem like a slight, an oversight, but in the rigid social structure of the 1890s, it was a matter of strict and solemn protocol. The title First Lady was seen as inextricably, almost sacredly, linked to the president's wife. To grant it to another, even a daughter so soon after Caroline's death, would have been perceived as a shocking breach of decorum, a sign of disrespect to the deceased. Victorian mourning rituals were long and elaborate, and the idea of replacing the First Lady was simply unthinkable. Furthermore, there was the established tradition of the White House hostess. The nation was accustomed to female relatives stepping into the role. President Jefferson's daughter Martha had served. President Jackson's niece Emily Donaldson had been a celebrated hostess. And most famously, President James Buchanan, a lifelong bachelor, had relied on his beautiful and accomplished niece, Harriet Lane, who was so popular they called her the Democratic Queen. These women were respected, admired, and powerful in their own right, but they were never called First Lady. Mary McKee was simply the next in this long, unofficial line, so she served in this historical gray area, a First Lady in all but name. When the Harrison administration came to a close on March 4th, 1893, Mary Harrison McKee left the White House, likely with a sense of profound exhaustion and relief. She had fulfilled her duty to her father and her country. She had navigated an impossible situation with poise and strength. Now she could finally return to Indianapolis and resume her own life, a private citizen once more. But the greatest personal drama of her life was still to come. Back in Indianapolis, the Harrison family tried to piece together a new life outside the glare of the national spotlight. Benjamin Harrison, a man of immense energy and intellect, could not simply retire. He returned to his law practice, lectured, and remained an elder statesman of the Republican Party. Mary and her family settled back into the comfortable rhythms of Midwestern society. For about 2 years, a fragile peace held. Then, in 1895, the 62-year-old former president gathered his 2 adult children, Mary and her brother Russell, to make an announcement that would shatter their family. He planned to remarry. This news, while perhaps surprising, might have eventually been accepted by his children. But it was the identity of his intended bride that they found utterly unconscionable. The woman was Mary Scott Lord Dimmock. The name was an explosion in their quiet world. Mary Dimmock was 37 years old, a woman younger than Harrison's own daughter. But the age gap, while significant, was not the primary issue. The problem was her identity. She was Carolyn Harrison's niece. She was Mary McKee's first cousin. More intimately and more painfully than that, she had been brought to the White House by Carolyn herself to serve as her assistant and companion during the final years of the administration. She had been there, in the House, a trusted member of the inner circle, during Caroline's final agonizing illness. For Mary and Russell, the announcement felt like a dagger to the heart. In their eyes, their father was not just remarrying, he was replacing their mother with a younger version of a relative, a woman who had been a witness to their collective grief. It seemed to them a monstrous betrayal of their mother's memory. The implication in their minds was that this relationship had been budding while their mother was still alive, a thought they could not bear. They confronted their father. Accounts from the time suggest the conversations were heated and emotional. They pleaded with him to reconsider, appealing to his sense of family honor, to the memory of his wife of nearly 40 years. They argued that such a marriage would be a scandal, a stain on the family's name. But Benjamin Harrison, the human iceberg, was not a man to be swayed by emotional appeals. He was, by all accounts, a lonely man. He had found in Mary Dimmock intellectual companionship and genuine affection. He believed he was entitled to find happiness in his remaining years. He refused to back down. The line was drawn. The family bond, once a symbol of national unity, was irrevocably broken. In April 1896, when Benjamin Harrison married Mary Dimmock in a small ceremony, his son Russell and his daughter Mary were not there. Their public absence was a stunning and deliberate statement. The family feud was no longer a private matter. It was now a quiet scandal whispered about in the drawing rooms of Indianapolis and reported with discretion in the nation's newspapers. The estrangement was near total. Mary and her father, who had endured so much together in the White House, now lived in the same city as virtual strangers. Years passed with no contact. The silence was deep and bitter. Benjamin Harrison went on to have another child with his new wife, a daughter named Elizabeth. But the joy of a new family was forever tainted by the loss of the old one. The tragic standoff lasted until the very end. In March 1901, Harrison contracted pneumonia. As his condition worsened and it became clear he was dying, Mary and Russell were finally called to his bedside. They came, standing as strangers in the room of the father they had once been so close to. There were no grand scenes of reconciliation, no deathbed apologies or forgiveness. There was only a quiet, somber acknowledgement of the chasm that had opened between them and had never been closed. On March 13, 1901, Benjamin Harrison died, leaving behind a legacy of public service and a legacy of deep, unresolved family pain. For Mary Harrison McKee, her father's death marked the final closing of the most public and painful chapter of her life. She was 42 years old. From that point forward, she embraced privacy with a fierce determination. The woman who had once stood in receiving lines for hours, who had managed the social affairs of a nation, now retreated entirely from the public eye. She lived for another 29 years, a long and quiet final act to a life marked by such intense drama. She dedicated herself to her husband and her children. The little boy who had been the famous baby McKee grew up to become a successful businessman. Mary lived to see her children marry and have children of their own. She was a grandmother, a matriarch of her own small private world. She was a silent witness to the dawn of a new century, a world that was rapidly transforming. The Victorian era she had embodied gave way to the age of the automobile and the airplane, the turmoil of the First World War, the Jazz Age, and the onset of the Great Depression. Through it all, she remained Mrs. James McKee of Indianapolis, a woman who carried an extraordinary history, but who chose to keep it locked away. She passed away in 1930 at the age of 72 and was buried in the family plot in Indianapolis. Reunited in death with the mother she had so adored and the father from whom she had been so bitterly estranged. So we are left with the question, what is the legacy of Mary Scott Harrison McKee? She wrote no memoirs. She gave no interviews. She left behind no grand public works. Her legacy is quieter, more nuanced, and perhaps more profound. She represents the invisible labor of women throughout history, the daughters, sisters, and nieces who stepped out of the shadows to perform critical roles, only to recede again once their duty was done. Her story is a powerful reminder that the functioning of power is not just about the men who hold office. It is also about the support systems, often run by women, that allow them to govern. Her life is also a deeply poignant human drama. It is a story about the crushing weight of filial duty, the complexities of grief, and the tragic, irreparable fractures that can shatter even the most prominent of families. She shows us that the walls of the White House are no defense against the universal pains of love, loss, and betrayal. Mary Harrison McKee may be a footnote in the grand narrative of the American presidency, a ghost in the annals of the First Ladies. But for 5 agonizing, somber months, she was the steady beating heart of a White House in mourning. She was the daughter who did not flinch, the hostess who did not falter, and the woman who sacrificed a piece of her own life to uphold the dignity of a nation. Her story is not one of power, but of service, and that, in its own quiet way, is a legacy worth remembering.